Okay, so I want to just briefly go over. I know I said you're going to have a couple of books that we're going to use for our class. One of the books that we're using that I really love is called In the Palm of Your Hand, and this is the Poet's Portable Workshop by Steve Coet. And you're just getting your books and I know getting into everything this week. So I brought up my Kindle copy here. I just want to highlight one or two things in the first sections because I think it's really important for talking about, and we're going to get into so much of this next week as well. And just beginning your process and beginning approaching poetry and reading poetry. Cowett makes a lot of really good points here about the writing process in general and getting started writing, and sometimes some of the discomforts and some of the feelings that we have along the way of sharing our work, writing for ourselves. Sometimes, whether we're writing poetry or fiction or nonfiction or essays, sometimes writing makes us see people, places, things in a different way. Sometimes it makes us feel different emotions or different emotions comes up when we're writing. So he talks a great deal about this and being open to those sort of things, which I think is really cool. And especially how poetry can really open your own senses and open your own minds. I think a lot of the great points I love he makes in these first couple sections is definitely highlighting, your commitment to writing, the idea of trying to enjoy it. Yes, obviously this is in class, but you should try to enjoy it a little bit more. Creating time for yourself to write, whether it is for this class or on your own, writing can be extremely therapeutic or just stress releasing in a lot of different capacities. So you're blocking off time with this class, and so blocking off a little bit of time for yourself in that kind of manner. He talks about that. He highlights it with some different poems as well. So you're going to be reading this for this week. But the big parts of what we're going to focus on are talking about some of the components that come up with poetry, some of the aspects that we're going to be studying more intently. He talks about speak and memory. And what we're really going to focus on for our first prompt is just drawing our own experiences from memory. And talking a little bit about that. Memories can evoke a lot of feelings for you. They can certainly bring us back to certain moments. So that's one thing we want to look at in terms of poetry, in terms of looking at the different lines, looking at sort of the meanings here. So when you have your book, you're going to read through some of these parts for this week as well. There's some other aspects that we're going to look at too of poetry. Narrative is really important, like what type of story is being told throughout a poem. Storytelling is a big part of all different forms of writing, and certainly no less poetry. No matter if you're focusing on whatever type of topic, as Coet says, music, voice, image, language, everything depends upon some form of story that you're telling. So it's also really important to think about the narrator and the author. Whenever you're a poet or a fiction writer, you seem to be talking about your own experience. We don't know if that necessarily is really being autobiographical. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And of course, even in poetry, similarly to other forms of writing, you still have some sort of conflict and suspense. So, is there some sort of element of, internal, external conflicts that you're dealing with? Suspense, how do you keep us engaged? How are you building our momentum in the piece as well? Details are really important. And again, we're going to be talking about a lot about this next week after you read through it as well. I just want to give you a basic insight. But vivid details, that goes without saying that in writing, you have to make sure to paint that picture. Use sensory details. And of course, sometimes you have memories and pieces that come up that are sometimes too difficult to share verbally, but we have a better time and a better aspect of sharing them on the page. So I think that becomes really important. So these are some of the things, themes and point of view are going to be areas that we're going to dive into a little bit more. What are these, takeaways? What are these poems hinting at? Who is telling us these pieces? And how do we recall some of these memories? So we're going to take some of these, the idea of starting with memory for us and just kind of getting that down a little bit more. And so this is part of the readings of what you're going to look at for next week. I also have a really good supplemental site here. I'll bring it up. And this is one that I hope you'll take a closer look at as well. You want to make sure that you're getting the full scope of poetry, even if you're, like I said, coming back to it, or you are approaching it for the first time in a while, or it's been since high school since you read poetry. But I love this sort of little cheat sheet that we have up here, and I also posted this on our Canvas page because I think it's so true. We are often really intimidated by the mention of the word poetry. We think it's just sort of too far out there, we don't understand it, but there's a lot of different ways that we can look to make poetry really, really accessible. I love the idea that poetry is often reflected the voice of the time, and that's really true because obviously today not a lot of poems are going to sound as Shakespeare sounded or as some of the 16th century or 17th century poets that we're going to look at, but it doesn't mean that we can't like them. It doesn't mean that we can't see the value and the merit in them. So that's really important, just to kind of keep your mind open, and even if it's not your cup of tea, even if it doesn't jump out at you right off the bat, it can still teach you something. It's really important to know that writers, especially poets, are very particular about their tools. So poems are often, in a lot of capacity, shorter than some of the types of writing that you're used to. So you want to examine each word. You want to, as we talked about previously, look at not only what the actual definition is, but how you can extend that definition too. And you want to look how, if you use possibly a different word, how that would affect the poetry or make the reader feel. This leads to a lot of the other terminology that we're going to understand when talking about poetry. We use diction and tone. Some of these are going to sort of come off the page too. I won't go through every single one because I posted up there, and you should totally go through and read this, because when we're talking about poetry, and we use a lot of these terms in writing anyway, so they shouldn't sound too differently to you. We're just using them in the context of poetry. So diction, your precise choice of words. Imagery, what sort of descriptive words are being used. Allusion, when you reference to something else outside the poem. Alliteration, words of the same letter, and so forth. We're going to look at different rhythm patterns. So pentameter, we're going to look at repetition. And these are just some of the basic terminologies that you want to look through. It's also interesting here, you want to familiarize yourself with, one of the first things we're going to be talking about this week and next week. It's one of the first, ironically, it's like chapter 21 in your book, but it is one of the first things we're covering is talking about lines and talking about stanzas. So we want to look at separately lines of poetry. Some stanzas are a set number of lines long, so we can be very particular about how we go through them. You could have a couplet, which is your consecutive lines that rhyme, even though they don't have to. A tercet, quatrain, and of course your stanza. And still some other questions to consider, right? And these sort of overlap some of the other ones to think about too. There's a lot of different ways that you can consider starting to read poetry and looking at how each line or each stanza is sort of taken. So this is just another sheet I have up here. I think this is extremely helpful as well. Yes, it's a lot to sort of take in at once, but you want to reference all these as you're going through, because they're going to just make your life a little bit easier as you're approaching your own pieces of poetry like that. And of course, always, always, always ask questions.